The hoofprints in the fresh mud were impossible. Maverick Holloway was certain. No horses lived within 50 miles of his rural Montana cabin. Yet there they were, deep crescents pressed into the earth after last night's thunderstorm, leading from his property line straight into the dense pine forest that had stood untouched for decades. Maverick crouched beside the clearest print, his weathered fingers tracing the outline. At 62, he'd seen enough horse tracks to know these belonged to something extraordinary, a massive animal, perhaps 17 hands high, with shoes that bore an unusual pattern he couldn't quite place. The tracks were fresh, made sometime between midnight and dawn, and they headed directly toward the woods he'd been forbidden to enter as a child. Standing slowly, his arthritic knees protesting, Maverick squinted into the shadowy tree line. His grandmother's voice echoed from 40 years past. Those woods ain't for us, boy. Some places hold memories too heavy for the living. But Grandma Cordelia had been gone 2 decades now, and the man who'd inherited her cryptic warnings had grown tired of respecting boundaries. That made no sense. The morning sun filtered through the canopy as Maverick gathered his hiking gear. He'd moved to this isolated property 3 years ago, seeking solitude after his divorce and early retirement from the railroad. The land had been in his family for generations, passed down through his grandmother's side, though none of his relatives had ever lived here permanently. Now he understood why the silence was so complete it seemed to swallow sound, and strange things happened in the periphery of vision. But horses, in woods that hadn't been grazed or logged in living memory, the mystery gnawed at him. Following the trail proved easier than expected. The unknown horse had left a clear path through the underbrush, broken branches marking its passage like blazes on a hiking trail. Maverick moved carefully, his boots finding purchase on the carpet of pine needles that muffled his steps. The deeper he ventured, the more the forest seemed to change around him. The trees grew larger, more ancient, their trunks bearing scars from some long-ago fire. Shafts of golden light slanted through the canopy, illuminating patches of wild columbine and Indian paintbrush that shouldn't have been blooming this late in the season. The air itself felt different, thicker, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. After an hour of steady climbing, the hoofprints led him to a clearing he'd never seen before, though he'd thought he knew every inch of this land. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk easily 6 feet across, its branches spreading like protective arms over the space. Carved into the bark, so old the letters had grown wide and dark with age, were initials MH plus CB, 1971. Maverick's breath caught. Those were his initials, but he'd never been in these woods before, had never carved anything into this tree. The date made no sense either. In 1971, he'd been 11 years old and living in Billings with his parents, visiting Grandma Cordelia's farm only during summers. The hoofprints circled the oak 3 times before continuing deeper into the forest, as if the horse had been drawn to this spot, compelled to acknowledge whatever significance it held. Maverick touched the carved letters, feeling the rough bark beneath his fingertips, and for a moment, the world seemed to shift slightly, like a photograph sliding out of focus before snapping back to clarity. Somewhere ahead, hidden in the green depths, a horse whinnied long, low, and unmistakably real. The sound of the horse's call pulled Maverick forward like a rope around his chest. He'd heard thousands of horses in his lifetime, but this one's voice carried something different, a note of recognition, as if it knew him. The hoofprints continued beyond the oak, leading down a gentle slope toward what appeared to be a natural meadow carved from the heart of the forest. As Maverick pushed through a curtain of low-hanging pine boughs, the sight that greeted him defied everything he thought he knew about this land. A small log cabin sat in the center of the clearing, its chinked walls weathered silver gray, smoke curling lazily from a stone chimney. A vegetable garden flourished beside it, heavy with late-season tomatoes and squash, split-rail fencing enclosed. A modest corral where the source of the mysterious hoofprints stood calmly eating hay from a wooden trough. The horse was magnificent, a steel-gray stallion with a flowing mane that caught the dappled sunlight. But it was the cabin that stopped Maverick's heart. He knew this place, not from memory exactly, but from dreams he'd been having since childhood. Dreams so vivid he'd sometimes woken believing he'd actually been there. You found your way back. The voice came from behind him, calm and unsurprised. Maverick spun around to see a woman emerging from the cabin's shadow, wiping her hands on a faded apron. She was perhaps 70, with silver hair braided down her back and eyes the color of winter sky. Something about her face tugged at his memory, like trying to recall a song heard long ago. "I'm sorry," Maverick stammered. "I was following the horse tracks. I didn't know anyone lived back here. This is supposed to be my family's land." The woman smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face. "It is your family's land, Maverick. It always has been. I'm Felicity Brennan, though. You probably don't remember me. You used to call me Fee when you were small." The name hit him like a physical blow. Fee. Suddenly he was 7 years old again, spending summers at Grandma Cordelia's farm, begging to explore the woods that were always off limits. But there had been someone else, hadn't there? A girl who'd appeared sometimes at the forest's edge, who'd promised to show him secret places if he could ever find the courage to disobey his grandmother's rules. "That's impossible," he whispered. She was just a childhood imaginary friend. "My grandmother told me so." Felicity's laugh was like silver bells in the wind. "Your grandmother knew exactly who I was, Maverick. She was protecting you from a truth you weren't ready to understand. But you're ready now, or you wouldn't have been able to follow Ranger's trail." She nodded toward the gray stallion, who had lifted his head from the hay and was watching them with intelligent, dark eyes. Maverick felt the world tilting around him. "None of this makes sense. This cabin, this clearing, it wasn't here yesterday. I've walked every foot of this property. Time moves differently in the deep woods," Felicity said gently. "Some places exist between moments, in the spaces where memory and reality touch. This is your true childhood home, Maverick. The place you dreamed of but could never find, until now." She gestured toward the cabin, and Maverick noticed details that made his chest tight with recognition. The wooden rocking chair on the porch where he'd imagined reading countless books. The wind chimes made from polished stones that he'd somehow known would sound like distant water. The garden gate with its hand-forged latch that fit his adult hand perfectly, as if it had been waiting decades for his return. "I lived here once," he said, the words coming from someplace deeper than conscious memory. "With you, we were going to be married." Felicity nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "In 1971, you carved our initials in the old oak to make it official. But then your grandmother found out about us, about this place. She knew what it would cost you to stay. So she did what she thought was best. She made you forget." The gray stallion whinnied again, and the sound unlocked something in Maverick's mind. Suddenly he could remember riding bareback through these same woods, Fee's arms around his waist as they explored trails that existed only at twilight. He remembered building this cabin with his own hands, young and strong and full of dreams. He'd somehow lost along the way. How, he whispered. How is any of this possible? Felicity led him to the porch, where the rocking chair creaked familiarly under his weight. She settled beside him on a wooden bench that he now remembered crafting himself, planing each board smooth with patient care. The memories were returning like water through a broken dam. 40 years of forgotten life flooding back in fragments. Your grandmother was born with the sight, Felicity explained, her voice soft in the afternoon quiet. She could see the places where the world grows thin, where other possibilities bleed through. This clearing, this cabin, they exist in what she called the between, a space where time folds back on itself, where the life you might have lived runs parallel to the one you did live. Maverick struggled to process her words. But I remember growing up in Billings, high school, college, my job with the railroad, my marriage to Jana, the divorce, all of that happened too. Felicity nodded. When your grandmother pulled you out of the between, she gave you a different path, but she couldn't erase what had already been built here. The cabin waited. Ranger waited. She looked toward the stallion, who had wandered closer to the fence, and I waited. The implications crashed over him like a wave. You've been here alone for 40 years? Time moves differently here, remember. For me, it's only been a few months since you disappeared. I kept expecting you to come back from one of your rides, wondering why you were gone so long." Her smile was touched with sadness. "I aged, of course the between isn't completely separate from the regular world, but slowly, gently. I had hoped to sustain me." Maverick reached out tentatively and took her hand. Her skin was warm, solid, completely real. "Why now? Why am I able to see this place again? Because the bonds that held you to your other life have loosened. Your grandmother's spell was powered by her love for you, her desire to keep you safe from a choice she thought you'd regret. But love that controls isn't really love at all, it's fear. And fear fades when the one who holds it passes on." He thought of his recent years, the growing dissatisfaction with his marriage, the early retirement that had felt less like freedom than like escape, the inexplicable urge to buy his grandmother's old property and live there alone. Even his divorce had felt inevitable, as if Jana had been competing with someone who wasn't there, but should have been. "The night I decided to leave the railroad," he said slowly, "I dreamed about a gray horse. I'd been having the same dream for months." "Ranger has been calling you home," Felicity said. "Animals understand the between better than humans do. They don't divide the world into possible and impossible the way we do." Maverick stood and walked to the corral fence. The stallion approached immediately, pressing his great head against Maverick's chest with a familiarity that spoke of years of partnership. The moment their skin made contact, another flood of memories crashed through him, teaching Ranger to neck rein in this very corral, galloping through moonlit meadows, the countless times this magnificent creature had carried him safely through adventures his conscious mind had forgotten. "I remember building his stall," Maverick whispered. "I remember the day he was born, helping his mother through a difficult labor. I remember everything. The question is," Felicity said, rising to join him at the fence, "what do you want to do with those memories now?" Maverick looked around the clearing, at the cabin he'd built with his own hands, at the garden that bore the fruits of his labor, at the woman who'd waited for decades for his return. In his other life, he owned a house in town that felt empty despite being full of possessions. He had a bank account, a retirement plan, a carefully structured existence that felt increasingly hollow with each passing day here. He had something else entirely: purpose, belonging, a love that had somehow survived being torn apart by well-meaning interference, and the weight of forgotten years. "Can I stay?" he asked. "I mean, really stay? What happens to my other life?" Felicity's smile was radiant. "The between doesn't work like that, my love. You don't have to abandon one life for the other. You get to choose each day which world feels more real. Your grandmother forced you to forget this place because she was afraid you'd never want to leave it. She was probably right." Ranger nickered softly and nuzzled Maverick's shoulder, as if agreeing with Felicity's assessment. The late afternoon sun slanted through the trees, painting everything in gold, and for the first time in decades, Maverick felt the deep satisfaction of being exactly where he belonged. That evening, Felicity prepared a dinner that tasted like memory itself: wild trout from the stream that ran behind the cabin, vegetables from the garden he'd planted with his own hands in what felt like yesterday and 40 years ago simultaneously. They ate by candlelight at a table he'd built from local pine, their conversation flowing with the easy intimacy of people who'd shared countless such meals before. "What happened to the other me?" Maverick asked as they cleared the dishes. "The version that lived here until 1971. Felicity paused in her washing, soapsuds clinging to her hands. "He didn't disappear, if that's what you're worried about. The between doesn't work by erasure. When your grandmother pulled you out, she created let's call it a pause, like a book with a bookmark placed in the middle. The story stopped, but it wasn't destroyed." She dried her hands on a well-worn towel and led him to the cabin's single window, which looked out over the clearing toward the darkening forest. In the distance, fireflies were beginning their nightly dance, pinpricks of light against the gathering shadows. "Your grandmother was terrified of this place," Felicity continued. "She'd seen what happened to her own sister, who'd found her way into the between and never wanted to leave. Aunt Marianne disappeared when she was 19, and the family assumed she'd died or run away. But Cordelia knew better. She could sometimes glimpse Marianne in the spaces between spaces, living a life that was both more and less than the one she'd left behind. Maverick absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with his memories of his pragmatic, no-nonsense grandmother. So she was protecting me from making the same choice. She thought she was, but protection that comes through forgetting, well, it leaves holes in a person. Haven't you felt them? Those moments when you were happiest in your regular life, but still felt like something essential was missing. He had felt them during his wedding to Jana, standing at the altar with a nagging sense that he was betraying someone, during the birth of the children they'd never had, when Jana had miscarried, and he'd found himself grieving not just the lost pregnancy, but a life he couldn't quite remember wanting. During every sunset he'd watched alone, feeling like he should be sharing it with someone whose face he couldn't recall. "How do I know this isn't just what I wanted to believe?" he asked. "How do I know you're not just my mind's way of making sense of a midlife crisis?" Felicity smiled and kissed his cheek. "You don't. That's what makes it a choice instead of an inevitability. Faith always requires a leap." That night, they lay together in the bed he'd built 40 years ago, her head on his shoulder as she slept peacefully. Maverick stared at the ceiling, where moonlight created shifting patterns through the window. He could feel his two lives pulling at him like competing tides. The practical world, where he owned property and had responsibilities, and this impossible place where he'd apparently once been young and in love and entirely different from the man he'd become. Toward dawn, he made his decision. He would return to his cabin, to his regular life, but only to settle his affairs. He would sell the property, or maybe not sell it, but leave it as a bridge between worlds. He would close bank accounts, tie up loose ends, say the goodbyes he'd avoided when he'd first retreated from society. Then he would come back to the between, to Felicity and Ranger, and the life that had been waiting patiently for his return. When he told Felicity his plan over breakfast, she nodded as if she'd expected exactly this response. "The between will be here when you're ready," she said. "It always has been. What if I can't find it again? What if this was a what I'm thing?" She reached across the table and took his hand. "You followed Ranger's hoofprints to find this place. He'll come for you again, when it's time. Animals understand about coming home better than people do." After breakfast, Maverick saddled Ranger for one last ride through the forest trails he was finally beginning to remember. The stallion moved with the fluid grace of a creature who'd never doubted his place in the world, carrying his rider through sun-dappled groves and across crystal streams that existed nowhere on any map. As they rode, more memories surfaced. He remembered being 28 years old and completely certain that this was where he belonged. He remembered plans he and Felicity had made, children they would raise in this magical clearing, adventures they would share as they grew old together, a life built on simplicity and love, and the deep satisfaction of living in harmony with something larger than themselves. He also remembered the morning his grandmother had appeared at the cabin's door, her face stern with determination and love. She'd spoken words he couldn't quite recall, but their effect had been immediate and complete. One moment he'd been kissing Felicity goodbye before riding out to check their boundary markers, and the next he'd been 11 years old again, standing in his grandmother's farmhouse kitchen with no memory of ever having been anywhere else. Now, returning to the clearing as the sun reached its zenith, Maverick felt the weight of choice settling on his shoulders. He could live safely in the world he knew, or he could step into the unknown and reclaim the life he'd lost. The choice, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. The journey back to his regular cabin felt like traveling through dimensions. One moment Maverick was following Ranger's familiar hoofprints through the pine forest, and the next he was emerging from the tree line into his own backyard, where his pickup truck sat exactly where he'd left it that morning. The transition was so seamless he might have imagined the entire experience, except for the pine needles clinging to his boots and the lingering scent of wood smoke in his hair. Over the following weeks, Maverick moved through his regular life with the methodical precision of a man, dismantling a structure he no longer needed. He contacted a real estate agent about selling his house in Billings, though he kept the family property. He closed all but one bank account, keeping enough money for basic needs, but donating the rest to a local horse rescue. He called his few remaining friends to explain that he was embarking on a new chapter. Though he couldn't quite explain what that chapter would look like, the hardest call was to Jana, his ex-wife, who'd remarried and moved to Seattle but still checked on him occasionally out of lingering affection. "You sound different, Mav," she said during their brief conversation, lighter somehow, like you've finally figured out whatever it was you were looking for. "I think maybe I have," he replied, surprised by the truth of it. "Good. You deserve to be happy. We both did, just not together." After he hung up, Maverick realized that Jana had been right about their marriage from the beginning. They'd both been settling, choosing safety over passion, familiarity over the unknown. She'd found her happiness with her new husband. Now, it was his turn to reach for his. Every few days, Ranger's hoofprints would appear in his yard, always leading toward the forest. Maverick never followed them immediately. He had work to do in his regular world. But their presence reassured him that the between wasn't a what-I'm hallucination. Felicity was waiting. His other life was waiting. As autumn deepened into winter, he established a routine of sorts. He would spend his days handling practical matters, then follow Ranger's trail into the forest where time moved differently, and seasons seemed suspended in eternal late summer. He helped Felicity preserve vegetables from their garden, chopped wood for the winter that might or might not come to their magical clearing, and slowly remembered skills his younger self had possessed: how to repair a roof, how to gentle a spooked horse, how to love someone completely without reservation. "You're straddling two worlds," Felicity observed one evening as they sat by the fire. "It's not sustainable long term." "I know," Maverick admitted, "but I'm not ready to abandon everything I built in the other life. What if I'm making a mistake? What if this is just elaborate wish fulfillment?" Felicity was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "My father used to say that the heart knows truths the mind hasn't learned yet. You've spent 40 years living someone else's idea of what your life should be. Maybe it's time to trust your own instincts." That night, Maverick dreamed of his grandmother. She appeared to him as he remembered her from childhood: tall, formidable, with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. In the dream, they stood in her farmhouse kitchen, the same room where she'd somehow stolen his memories all those years ago. "You're angry with me," she said without preamble. "I'm trying not to be," Maverick replied. "I understand you thought you were protecting me. I was protecting you. Do you have any idea what it costs to live in the between? What you sacrifice when you choose a life that exists outside normal time? Tell me." His grandmother gestured toward the window, which looked out not on her familiar farm, but on the forest clearing where Maverick had rediscovered his lost love. "You give up the possibility of children who will grow up in the regular world. You give up career advancement, retirement savings, the approval of society. You choose love over security, magic over safety. Most people aren't strong enough to make that choice and live with the consequences. But what if I am strong enough?" She studied him with those penetrating eyes, and for the first time since he'd been a child, Maverick felt like she was really seeing him, not the boy she was trying to protect, but the man he'd become. "Maybe you are," she said finally. "Maybe I was wrong to choose for you instead of letting you choose for yourself. The between is still there, Maverick. It's been waiting for you to come home." When he woke, Maverick knew his time of straddling two worlds was ending. Spring was approaching in his regular life, and he could feel the pull of the forest growing stronger. It was time to make his final choice. On the first warm day of March, Maverick loaded his pickup truck with the few possessions he couldn't bear to leave behind: his grandfather's tools, his grandmother's photo albums, a handful of books that had shaped his thinking over the years. Everything else he gave away or sold, keeping only what would fit in the truck's bed and cab. His realtor had been puzzled by his decision to keep the family property while selling everything else. "It's pretty isolated out there," she'd warned. "No neighbors for miles, sketchy cell service, harsh winters. Are you sure you want to live there full time?" "I'm sure," Maverick had replied, though he wasn't planning to live there in any way she would understand. Now, parking the truck at the edge of the forest, where he'd first discovered Ranger's mysterious hoofprints, Maverick felt the rightness of his choice settle into his bones. He'd spent months moving between two versions of his life, but he'd never felt complete in either one. Only here, at the threshold between worlds, did he feel like himself. The hoofprints were waiting for him, as fresh as if Ranger had passed by moments before. This time, Maverick didn't hesitate. He shouldered his backpack and followed the trail, into the trees, leaving his old life behind with each step. The journey to the clearing felt different this time, more like a homecoming than a discovery. The forest welcomed him with familiar scents and sounds, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant call of a hawk, the soft sound of his boots on the needle-carpeted path. He moved with growing confidence, his body remembering routes his mind had forgotten. When he finally pushed through the curtain of low-hanging branches and emerged into the clearing, Felicity was waiting for him exactly as she had been that first day, wiping her hands on her apron as she stepped out of the cabin's shadow. But this time, her smile held no surprise, only joy and welcome, and the deep satisfaction of a long wait. Finally ended. "You came back to stay," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I came home," Maverick replied, and knew it was true. Ranger nickered, a greeting from the corral, and Maverick went to him first, pressing his face against the stallion's warm neck and breathing in the scent of hay and horse and belonging. The animal had waited for him, had called to him across impossible distances, had guided him back to the life he was meant to live. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun set over their private kingdom, Felicity asked the question Maverick had been expecting. Any regrets? He considered the question seriously. In his other life, he'd been comfortable, respectable, following a path that millions of people would consider ideal. He'd had steady income, social security, a house in a good neighborhood. Here he had uncertainty, magic, and a love that existed outside the normal flow of time. "None," he said finally. "Not a single one, even though we can't know what comes next, even though the between doesn't come with guarantees." Maverick took her hand, marveling again at its warmth and solidity. "Especially because of that. I spent 40 years living a guaranteed life, and it felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. This feels like coming alive." As if in response to his words, the forest around them seemed to shimmer with approval. Fireflies began their evening dance early, filling the clearing with gentle light. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird sang a song Maverick had never heard before but somehow knew by heart. "Welcome home, my love," Felicity whispered, and kissed him as the stars emerged overhead. That night, for the first time in 40 years, Maverick slept without dreaming of places he couldn't remember, or people whose faces he couldn't quite recall. He slept the deep, peaceful sleep of a man who had finally found his way back to himself. 5 years passed in the between, though Maverick never could have said if that meant 5 years in the regular world or 50. Time moved like honey in their clearing, sweet and golden and impossible to measure by ordinary standards. He and Felicity fell into the rhythms of a life that felt both utterly new and deeply familiar, tending their garden, maintaining the cabin, exploring forest trails that revealed new wonders with each season. Maverick's hands, soft from years of office work and early retirement, grew calloused again from honest labor. He expanded their vegetable garden, built a workshop where he crafted furniture from fallen trees, and learned to preserve meat from the deer that wandered trustingly through their clearing. His body grew lean and strong, his mind clear and focused, in ways it hadn't been since his youth. But it was the nights that convinced him he'd made the right choice. Lying beside Felicity in the bed he'd built with his own hands, listening to the forest breathe around them, Maverick felt the deep contentment that had eluded him throughout his regular life. This was what his grandmother had tried to protect him from, not danger, but a happiness so complete it made ordinary existence seem pale by comparison. "Do you ever wonder about the other timeline?" Felicity asked one autumn evening as they sat by the fire. "The life you might have lived if you'd never found this place?" Maverick considered the question while whittling a whistle from a piece of maple. "I think I did live it. For 40 years, I lived the safe version of my story. Now I'm living the true version. And if someone forced you to choose again, if circumstances required you to return to the regular world?" He looked at her across the firelight, this woman who'd waited decades for his return, who'd kept their impossible love alive through sheer faith and determination. "I'd find my way back to you. I'd always find my way back," as if summoned by their conversation, Ranger appeared at the cabin window, pressing his nose against the glass. The stallion was graying around the muzzle now, showing his age despite the magical properties of the between. But his eyes were still bright with intelligence and mischief, and he still delighted in carrying Maverick through the forest on adventures that existed nowhere on any map. "He's been restless lately," Felicity observed. "I think he wants to explore beyond our usual boundaries." The next morning, Maverick saddled Ranger for what would prove to be their most significant journey yet. Instead of following the familiar trails that circled their clearing, the stallion headed toward a part of the forest they'd never explored. Dense, ancient woods where the trees grew so thick that noon felt like twilight. After hours of careful travel, they emerged into a valley Maverick had never seen before. At its center stood a cluster of cabins arranged around a communal garden, smoke rising from several chimneys. People moved among the buildings with the unhurried grace of those who lived outside, ordinary time men and women of various ages, all with the same look of deep contentment Maverick recognized in his own reflection. An elderly man approached as Maverick dismounted, his weathered face creasing into a welcoming smile. "You must be Maverick. We've been expecting you." "Expecting me?" Word travels in the between. "We heard Cordelia's grandson had finally found his way home." "I'm Bartholomew Chen. I've been here since 1962. My family thought I died in Vietnam, but really I just found a better war to fight." Over the following hours, Maverick met a dozen residents of what they called Haven people who'd discovered the between at various points in their lives and chosen to make it their permanent home. There was Iris, a former nurse who'd arrived in the 1980s after a near-death experience opened her perception to other realities. Marcus, a jazz musician from the 1950s whose music had literally transported him to this place during a particularly transcendent performance. Luna, a young artist who'd stumbled into the between while painting in the desert and decided the magic was worth more than fame. Each had a story of discovery, of choosing the impossible over the merely difficult. Each had left behind a regular life that no longer fit, trading security for wonder, predictability for magic. "But don't you miss it?" Maverick asked during the communal dinner they shared. "The regular world, I mean, modern conveniences, technology, connection to the broader human story?" "We are connected to the broader human story," Iris replied. "We're just connected to the parts that matter most: love, community, the relationship between people and the land. As for the rest," she shrugged, "there's always been more than enough suffering in the regular world. We chose to focus on creating more joy instead." That evening, as he and Ranger made their way back to their own clearing, Maverick reflected on what he'd learned. The between wasn't just a refuge for two lovers displaced by well-meaning interference. It was a whole world, populated by people who'd chosen magic over mundanity, who'd decided that a smaller life lived fully was preferable to a larger life, lived partially. He found Felicity waiting on the porch, as if she'd known exactly when he would return. "You met the others," she said, reading his expression easily. "Why didn't you tell me about them?" "Because you needed to discover your own relationship with this place first. Community is wonderful, but it can't substitute for individual purpose. You had to know who you were in the between before you could know who you might become as part of something larger." As they prepared for bed that night, Maverick felt a deep sense of completion settling over him. He'd found not just his lost love and his true home, but his people, a community of souls who'd made the same impossible choice he had, who'd traded the known for the unknowable and found themselves richer for the exchange. "No regrets?" Felicity asked, as she did sometimes on nights when the magnitude of their choice seemed particularly vast. "None," Maverick replied, pulling her close. "Only gratitude." Outside their window, Ranger whinnied softly in his corral, and the sound seemed to carry approval from the forest itself. They'd all come home: the man who'd been lost for 40 years, the woman who'd waited faithfully for his return, and the horse who'd made it all possible by leaving hoofprints in the mud and trusting that love was stronger than forgetting. In the distance, just at the edge of hearing, came the sound of other horses the rest of Heaven's herd, calling their own people home through the magical woods where time moved like honey, and every day it was a choice to embrace the impossible. Maverick smiled and let the sound carry him into dreams of tomorrow's adventures. secure in the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged, living exactly the life he was meant to live, surrounded by exactly the people who understood that some things were worth any sacrifice. The between had claimed him completely, and he had never been happier to be lost.